Welcome to the Intelligent Business Show, a podcast from Aberdeen discussing the latest trends to keep you and your business at the top of your class. And now, here's your host, Aberdeen's CMO in residence, Matthew Grant.
Hello, and welcome to the Intelligent Business Show, the podcast that focuses on the ways that organizations just like yours are using data to make their business more intelligent. I'm your host, Matthew Grant, CMO in residence here at Aberdeen. This week on the show, we're speaking with Chertok, Aberdeen's analyst focused on the human capital management space. I invited Zach to the show to discuss the various ways that data is changing how organizations approach talent acquisition, talent management, and talent development. Let's dive in. So, Zach, welcome to the Intelligent Business Show.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me.
I know. It's nice to bring our hallway conversations right here to the airwaves for our listeners out there. And so the way I want to get started is in a recent conversation we had, you said, we need the deeper data sphere. And I wasn't exactly sure who you meant by we, so let's start there. Who actually needs the deeper data sphere?
That's a great question, Matt, because I think that there's so many people out there that are either sick of data, are picking and choosing the data that they want to look at, and are generally sort of unsure where to start. But I think when we talk about the audience, it started off, 20, 30 years ago with the proverbial geeks in the back room, with the technologists who knew of the potential for technology to improve productivity, but didn't quite know how to manipulate it to get the data to mean something for strategy. I think as time went on, then the management layer started to pick it up. We saw the elimination of middle management as a result of it. But managers started to get smarter about, okay, if data's telling me this, I need to switch from protocol 1 to protocol 2. What ended up happening then is we got into this kind of workforce paradigm where the technology was telling us how to work, and the managers are being driven to different protocols based on what the data was telling them, but we still weren't seeing sort of productive ends. So when we talk about the deeper data sphere today, it's about managers getting insights about the entire workforce and having access to the data sphere that way. It's about the technologists facilitating the flow rather than being in total control of the data the way they were 20, 30 years ago. And it's about the end user actually being able to see their own data and identify the processes, procedures, interaction points, and protocols that are going to get them to show up on their manager's radar. So today, it's really about everybody having access, but having different unique ways in which they have defined pathways to get into the data sets that are important to them.
Which, of course, raises the question of what are the data sets that are most important to people, particularly if they're in a human resources kind of management functions. Because it's interesting. I feel like if we look at supply chain or almost anything that has where efficiency is what you're driving towards, we've seen people have tried to be intensely data-driven and, in fact, are in those spaces. With human resources, it seems like, of course, as you're saying, over the last 20, 25 years, human resources functions and the way even leadership thinks about human resources have tried to become more and more data-driven, but my sense is we're not quite there yet, or there's important gaps there. So going back to what you originally just said, what are the different types of data sets? You essentially had three stakeholders: management, the technologists or people who are managing the platforms and stuff that people are using in their day-to-day work lives, but then also the sort of employees and workers themselves. So what is the kind of data universe that is really critical here? And just to add and make the question even longer, are there types of data, for example, that have traditionally been used that, in fact, aren't super useful, and certain types of data that are just being ignored?
This is a really great multifaceted question, but it's also sort of a little ambiguous and a little bit sort of contradictory to the traditional way we think about data when we talk about people in particular. The first thing to keep in mind is people can't be quantified. When we talk about things like supply chain, we're talking about a static product moving from start to finish. We're talking about different objects being managed through standard procedures, a couple of interaction points, but things that are getting more mechanical by the day.
Yep.
With people, that's not the case. You can't standardize the way all people operate the best, and you really don't want to use data to sort of demographically bucket people. In point of fact, When we talk about industries like insurance, more and more governments are starting to prevent industries from bucketing people because it's a hindrance to productivity. And it ends up writing people out of the system so that they engage it less, risks go up, and the very data that they're trying to improve, they end up losing track of. So when we talk about people are at the stage of the process that come before the product. So the people are creating the processes that manage the products. They shouldn't be being driven by the processes that the products move through. So what that means is, and when we talk about data, it means that, yes, managers need access to sort of the overall sort of performance picture, but they need it in a way that they can drill down. So when we talk about performance management, for instance, we see a whole host of new resources coming online or that have come online in the last 5-10 years in a very strong way that are contributing sort of subtle data sets that, when combined, paint a real picture of what productivity, engagement, incentive movements are actually looking like. So, for example, when we talk about a typical performance cycle management today, managers might be looking at real-time participation rates in different rewards campaigns for a specific department to see if the different campaigns and management initiatives are actually pulling the workforce forward in a way that the workforce is interested in pursuing. They might be looking at wellness and well-being use cases to understand the kinds of stresses employees are facing. Are they work-driven? Are they personal-driven? And how do we sort of manage those so that the employee is facilitated to do the best work they can absent those stresses? We might also be looking at sort of time to productivity from a time and attendance perspective, pulling time a little bit away from that cost, that sort of cost attachment that it's had for so long, and pulling it into more of an independent commodity to say, hey, if we allocated 3 hours for task A, but it only took 2.5, how can we optimize that extra half hour to get an employee onto the right learning track, to get them to learn the next skill set that we know will bump them up to that promotion that much faster? And it's about individualizing the different tracks based on emerging employee interests, known employee stresses, and keeping them really between the level of resource consumption that is both equitable for the company, but also moving the needle on that employee's performance forward, over the long term of an employee's career. When we look at data that Aberdeen pulls back, for instance, we know that employees want to see career tracks. They want to see the ability to grow and develop at the organization, and they want to see a strong sort of buy-in from the organization towards their career track, that kind of investment that we all hear about has been missing for so long. And one of the key ways organizations are getting there is managers have access to these subtle data sets that paint a much better real-time performance picture to understand how to individually drive employees based on their interests and their engagement tactics. For employees at the same time, it's very important to give the individual employees access to their individual performance profile so that they know how they're being perceived by management, but also so that they know what their own inhibitors are. They can recognize things that they may not have perceived as being outwardly obvious. They might have thought they were doing a good job keeping home life at home and work life in the office, but realistically, some of those stresses are carrying forward, and what resources are the office providing that they can take advantage of to kind of better mitigate that. And it allows management and the employees to kind of be on the same side of the table when they're resolving certain problems. And all of these, what we used to think of as touchy-feely data points, they are getting more and more personalized and are becoming more and more important towards allowing employees to feel comfortable being creative, putting their best foot forward, standing out from the general workforce, and maybe defying some of those standardized protocols to improve the business environment and improve the general processes with which the product or service gets to market. And it really is, again, about individualizing data respect to each individual employee and making sure that we're not boxing employees into one category or another to the point that half your workforce just falls out.
Right. So actually, there's a lot of things that you said there that got me thinking in a lot of different directions. So I'll just choose one more or less at random. So remember, my question had started with what sorts of data sets, and you started talking about these subtle data sets, which on some level sounded like qualitative as well as quantitative data sets. when I asked, so what kind of data sets do people want, what I was sort of realizing in the way what your response sort of illuminated for me was the type of data anyone needs in a particular situation obviously depends on the goal that they're actually trying to achieve. And I think you sketched out at least something that should be a change in sort of mindset across workforce management, I guess, and human resources management more generally, which is, is the goal cost savings? Like, so you had this example of, something I thought was going to take them 2.5 hours, it only took them 2. The cost savings model would be like, okay, great. Maybe can I get fewer people and they have them work 100% of the time and get rid of these half hours of idle time or something like that, as opposed to a model which is more employee focused on employee career development and fostering employee retention, employee engagement, and employee investment. In the enterprise. And it sounds to me like you're saying the trend has been to go more in that direction and try to be more employee-centric in the processes and protocols that we're working with in the human resources management world.
That's actually a really good statement because that gets to the very sort of contradictory nature I had mentioned at the beginning, which is management is still very much on this kick. We hear it from HR all the time. Reduce costs, improve efficiency, streamline operations however you can, because they are still in the very late 1990s, early 2000s paradigm of running the leanest organization possible. And the funny part is today, everything about economics is kind of saying you might want to be going in a different direction. Part of the research that I've been doing while I've been down working with Columbia University is looking at the macro picture as well, and basically understanding that, we've had no real inflation in the market. Salaries haven't gone up. The kind of corporate investment that employees are demanding that we see coming out of our surveys at Aberdeen are not really being reflected in the workplace. And the reason they're not being reflected is because HR for the last about 30 years has given into the management goal of just reduce costs and insulate the organization from any risk possible. Yes, the workforce is one of the riskiest assets an organization can take on, but it's also the one that always has the highest return potential, because without it, you don't have innovation. If you don't hire the 10 people to work at your organization, you don't get the 1 out of the 10 that's going to raise their hand and say, I know how to do this better. You don't get that innovation layer. And what we see in the market today is the lack of corporate spend is causing stagnation. Salaries don't go up, people don't spend money, cost of living gets bifurcated between cities that are improving versus ones that aren't, and people just don't have the security they want. They don't have the corporate investment behind them that's going to get them to be willing to take more risks in their day-to-day life and at work. So we have stagnation and we have a lack of general growth. And when we try to translate that back to the individual workplace, HR is now on the opposite side of the table of management. They know management is coming down and saying, we want you to reduce costs, but HR is turning around and saying, okay, we think we can improve efficiency by a better margin than we can reduce costs. So let's start taking a look at how we can use our resources to do that and see if we can just prove the operational picture by the end of the year. This isn't happening across the board. What we're starting to see from Aberdeen's own survey data and the technology use case is that there are indicators that HR is willing to take the risk, and that the willingness to do that is improving if the organization has a CHRO. Basically, that HR has a seat at the executive table. So the role of HR is kind of shifting to accommodate this new performance paradigm, particularly as the technology world is trying to drive them there. Where HR is getting more and more backing and a little bit more confidence to not just be a risk insulator against people, but to actually take more of a chance that the workforce can deliver better than just sitting on what they already have.
Right. And what you're saying there, too, is moving it away, like in terms of corporate kind of leadership structure, is, I guess, the traditional model is essentially VP of Human Resources reports up into finance or CFO or something like that, and which in a sense shows, okay, human capital. People take the metaphor too literally and say, okay, this is really just a financial question, so the CFO should be over HR.
Well, and at the end of the day, the finance position in almost every organization became about reducing risk, mitigating, any cost overruns, and in the event that productivity dropped, okay, we're going to immediately engage in staff layoffs because that's what the algorithms tell us to do. One thing that always made no sense is the fact that particularly public sector shines as the greatest example of this. Work furloughs are the most costly kind of cost reduction you can do. It should be the last thing you want to do.
Right.
Labor is the biggest asset weighted in strong ROI potential, and the last thing you want to do is engage in layoffs first. Right. It's the surest sign your company's in trouble.
So, yes, as we've clearly seen just current events, this layoffs and furloughs being an entirely counterproductive move, even when it comes to governing, and as it turns out. But a lot of things we've been talking about here today are reminding me of other conversations we've had on the show thus far. And so one thing I wanted to start with was we had a guest on here from a company called Sapience, and what they do is they look at essentially time employees are spending within key applications, and they were saying their kind of pitch to the marketplace was, we're going to actually show you how work is happening at your company in a sort of granular way. And they had some good stories about how they didn't use this information to lay people off. They, in fact, used it as a way to actually reconfigure how work happened and then have a positive impact on retention and things like that. So I was just wondering from the marketplace standpoint, or does that make sense to you as the first problem that companies can tend to have is they don't actually know what's happening inside their four walls?
That's actually a really great question. We don't necessarily, I wouldn't say that problem sort of as generally put as that is what is the major challenge today. It's definitely a big challenge, and the larger the organization, the greater the risk of that challenge.
Sure.
Because managers will turn to technology to maintain the same sort of behavioral standard with a 1 to 100 manager to employee ratio as they did with a 1 to 30 employee to manager ratio. So they'll turn to the data a little bit more to kind of understand where they have to interact with the workforce more strategically. But consequently, the bigger the organization goes, the less they'll intrinsically know what is going on unless they just have a phenomenal born with sense of intuition.
Right.
But at the end of the day, too, this shift to real-time performance management with a lot of those sort of subtle data sets that I mentioned earlier are starting to enable managers more and more to be able to understand when undercurrents of things like disengagement are emerging before they negatively impact the organization or before they irreparably impact the organization. So we're starting to see the tools adapt a little bit more to kind of fix that problem. Where the biggest issues run aground is where the corporate hierarchy is either so rigid that there's no strategic effort to align management goals with individual employee goals. So basically, again, employees come in, all of this engagement capital might be there, but the way goals are structured and the way communications are structured basically tell the employees, that's lovely, but this is what your end goal is, so we really don't care how you achieve it as long as you do. That's kind of like the 50% the 50% of the way mile marker on engagement, because you're basically telling employees, we're not going to tell you how to do it, but you're also telling employees, we don't care how you do it as long as you get it done. So what I would say today is a much bigger sort of roadblock to organizations is that we've gone beyond just generically not knowing what's going on to having an ends justifies the means, modus operandi among managers, particularly the larger the organization gets.
Right.
This concept, what started as willful ignorance in the financial world and got us into trouble in 2008, 2009 has become kind of a management way of life that again, it doesn't really matter to us how different departments get the job done as long as they do and as long as they hit their performance metrics.
Right. And what you've talked about in your writing a lot is this real disconnect that we even kind of touched on there between management goals, corporate goals, and these individual career goals of the employees. Mm-hmm. And somehow even, trying to connect the two or even show from a management standpoint that that's something you care about or more realistically in terms of how it plays out. Often the management is sending, to your point just now, is sending the message that actually we don't care that much about your individual goals as long as kind of we're getting what we need.
Well, and when you think about trying to drive performance and productivity, this is kind of a problem because where, pre probably 1980s, CEOs would be hired to really focus on the performance picture inside organizations because we still had true production environments, where today we have services and innovation-oriented environments. The CEO now is hired to focus on the capital management for the board of the organization. So there's been a behavioral shift in terms of where those responsibilities lie. And so they're almost incentivized, whether it's through their pay structures or through their, or through their management objectives handed down by the board, to not necessarily care as much about how that human capital is plugging into the organization as long as it's doing so in a productive way that justifies revenue and expenses at the end of the year.
The other thing I was thinking about and coming back to the notion of is this disconnect obviously leads to a kind of employee disengagement. The notion of how critical employee engagement is to retention and productivity and all this other stuff is definitely out there. My question there comes down to a sort of measurement of engagement. And I was wondering if you had seen, because we were speaking also with Rachel Hoppe about community engagement, because she works with community management with super large corporations, and was talking about getting more complex in terms of how they how they think about engagement. I'm wondering if you've seen interesting data-driven models within the HR space focused very much on measuring and driving engagement, or even defining it in a sense metrically?
Sure. I think it was we're going on 3 years ago now when HR Tech, the conference, was last in Chicago. And engagement was the buzzword. I don't think there was a single booth that didn't have "We drive employee engagement" somewhere in their literature. And buzzwords make me insane. I will admit right up front, if you can't define it, don't use the word. It's kind of like owning an SUV. If you can't drive it, don't own it. So just as an aside, but nevertheless, engagement is untenable. You can't define it. But it is a driver of other metrics. The reason you can't define it is because for every employee, the way they engage, what it means to them, and the kind of value towards their work ethic that it has is very, very different. It's a culturally infused topic. When you look at your workforces, say in Asia, their work ethic is very much segregated to a certain extent from their willingness to engage work in their day-to-day lives. When you come into the Western world, it's very, very different. In the U.S., for example, engagement has as much to do with about being motivated behind your work as it does with carrying that motivation into how you live your life, how you build your dependencies, what you talk about with your friends, and what you're motivated behind day in and day out every minute of your life. There are different cultures have different separations, so engagement cannot be defined in a uniform way. What can be defined is when you're looking at your performance and productivity data, when you're looking at those underlying sort of subtle data sets, is to understand, okay, I gave my workforce a goal. I gave them a set of tasks that needed to be accomplished. The way I gave it to them, the way I communicated it to them, is it being received? Are we hitting our time targets? Does it look like our estimates are going to level up? Where is our productivity, our time management lying? Are employees showing up 5 minutes early for work? Are they, going home early? What are the reasons for that? When we start to paint the whole performance picture, that's when we're going to see if these different engagement tactics are resulting in improved performance metrics. And that's how you pull together an entire sort of engagement picture. It needs to be real time. I don't think you can forecast engagement for the simple reason that, again, it's behavioral. There's no way to equitably fully quantify it. So at the end of the day, you have to look at your productivity forecast. You have to look at your employee performance indices, different resources, how they're being used, and try to get an intuitive idea of how does employee A differ from employee B? What are the reasons for that? Are they reasons I can impact? And if so, how do I best do that? It's a pathway towards behavioral improvement.
Right. And I think as we come around to the end here, I kind of want to follow this through a little bit. One of the notes as you were talking I wrote down was data and alienation. Mm-hmm. And when we first started talking about this and data and human capital management, you had said humans can't be quantified and we shouldn't sort of push them to, I guess, just align themselves with some sort of data-defined processes and protocols. It reminded me a little bit of early 19th century or early 20th century sort of Taylorism and things like that, doing, time studies and all this other stuff and creating a super quantified, optimized way of doing things and fitting humans in as if they were cogs. I mean, it was really obviously the first step towards automation was doing something like that. So I guess my question here is, as far as what recommendations would you give to organizations so that they can actually be more data-driven and more data kind of conscious and thoughtful, or data mindful, if you would, with regards to productivity management, workforce management, and et cetera, without being alienating to their employees in doing so?
Sure. And it's actually funny that you mentioned Taylor because I was a decent student of Taylorism, but even Taylor believed that if you don't hire the 10, you don't get the one innovator. Because you put people on a standard process, that one person raises their hand and says, I see the big picture, I'm a game changer, I can make this better. So Taylorist was a people person and also, an industrialist, and we don't have enough of those anymore. But nevertheless, if I had to make recommendations, the first thing is stop thinking about talent acquisition and talent and performance management as two separate entities. Today's workforce is all about equitable talent placement, whether that's coming from inside or outside the organization. And you should always be looking at both the external metric world and the internal metrics of your organization to match productivity up to performance potential as it's being defined by the market. Your corporate objectives among the C-suite now come from shareholders, which are driven by external performance goals and driven by the portfolio of things that the shareholders are invested in. We may not like the structure, but that means that we have to look both inside and outside the organization to understand how best to find skills and place talent. That has everything to do with corporate culture as it does down to what employees have the right skills to do the right jobs. The second thing is don't let your ATSs do all of your sort of talent screening in early hiring. Applicant tracking systems are getting way too specific in terms of the job description. They're writing off employees, prospective employees that have skills potential, just because they don't have the skills on their resume today to match up to what the job is looking for. And we're largely, more than 60% of organizations today are getting B-level employees when they realistically have the tools to get the A-level inside. The next thing is make sure you have a good handoff from your applicant tracking system to your internal data HRIS system. Every organization builds up great engagement capital, great employee profiles for those incoming top 5 identified candidates for a role. But more often than not, that data doesn't carry over in the onboarding process into the HRIS to set the manager up to continue engagement where the hiring process left off. This is a huge miss for organizations because time to productivity for those group companies is hanging at around 6 months to a year, where for those that hand the data off, it's shortening to almost a month.
Wow.
That's a huge difference. So equitable data management and data communications, if we start thinking about strategic linkages between these two stages in the employee life cycle, are extremely vital to productivity. The last piece really is when you're thinking about engagement, put yourself in your employee's shoes, have some empathy, and develop an intuition about when employees plug in, when they plug out, how they like to be communicated with, and what it really means to be a good manager. Your technology will not manage your workforce for you. You have to use your technology to understand the different sort of buy-ins that employees get for the goals you give them, and to start reading between the lines in your cumulative data sets, cross-referencing, cross-analyzing all contextual elements to understand why behavior changes. Is it coming from inside the organization? Is it you as a manager? Are you playing favorites even if you didn't realize it? Are you being discriminatory in some way, again, even if you didn't realize it? Are there different things that are changing inside the organization that maybe you're not adapting to well, but your employees are outgrowing you? And how do you resolve that without being threatened by an emerging employee's upward potential that might surpass you? How do you break down all of these elements and make sure that the typical issues of corporate politics are not getting in the way of the employee's willingness to work and achieve the goals that you know need to be achieved? And all of the data resources, from rewards management systems to wellness and well-being systems to digital performance tracking, time and attendance, time to performance, all of these things will contribute to a manager's understanding of what the full contextualized picture looks like. And then, again, on the backside, always be engaging in succession planning, assessing your flight risks, understanding the ones you can resolve, but staying away from the ones that you can't. You know, empathy is good, but don't be too empathetic to the point that your succession plan tries to save employees at all costs.
Right.
There is the point at which there's really nothing you can do, and you just hope that you part on good terms, because 3 years down the line, they could come back to work for your organization, just not for you.
Right.
So just remember to treat your employees like people. Data is a tool to understand your people. It's not a replacement for managing them.
Right. So I love the breadth of what you laid out there, as well as your emphasis on the one hand on the need for interconnectivity between the technology you're relying on and the data that's flowing through the organization on the one hand, but also remember that the entire reason to be even cultivating these systems, building out these processes, et cetera, is to help the employee actually fit into the organization and ensure that the organization, in a sense, is fitting to what the employee is. What do I want to say here? Basically, being employee, the way that you kind of bridge the gap between data and alienation is making sure that all your data your data systems and strategies and the processes you're using to manage your data have as their end point employee engagement, employee development, and making sure there's a constant fit between the employee and the company, and how the company treats the employee and the external marketplace, if that makes sense.
Well, again, it fundamentally comes down to risk. At the end of the day, be part of the new HR, not the old HR. Be a part of the new HR that's willing to take a risk on the people that you hire, on the fact that the people will live up to the promise that you see in them, and own the risk that you take on them. If you're willing to hire them, there's a reason that you are willing to hire them. There's potential that you see in them, and you should be stopping at nothing to drive that potential. You shouldn't be trying to shift all of the burden to rise to the occasion onto them because you want to absolve yourself of the risk the minute they're in the organization. You took a chance on hiring them. You guys are in this together. And that's very, very important to remember when you're managing people, is that if you're a manager, you assume some of the risk for that performance. The only reason to come down on an employee is if they're really just making no effort.
Right. Nice. And on that note, Zach, we'll stop. So thank you very much for joining us on the Intelligent Business Show.
This was wonderful. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Next week, we'll be talking with Aaron Vitas, founder of Strategy Box. We'll be talking about how business leaders can leverage dashboards to improve performance. Talk to you then.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Intelligent Business Show. You can find this show on iTunes and Spotify, as well as on YouTube. And be sure to follow us on Twitter at Aberdeen_show. And if you want to know what's going on in your market space, be sure to check out Aberdeen.com.